In this episode of the Denoise Podcast, we're going to do a big breakdown of film and how it's still being used and if it's still relevant. Let's get into it. All right, so we're going to do a little special episode here because right now NAB is happening and we're recording this before NAB as this evergreen-ish episode, and we have mentioned talking about this for a while.
You and I have always been wanting to cover this topic.
Yeah, and I think a big reason why was Team 2 Films did this really great YouTube video about a month ago where they shot on 35mm film, 60mm film, compared it to digital, kind of showed the chemistry process of processing it, but kind of did a good breakdown of what it's like shooting on film if you never shot on film before, and good kind of cost comparison of, is it really that much more expensive? And I think the other interesting thing was the psychological benefits of shooting on film.
We'll get into that.
Yes. And the restraints that it forces on you and how that could also make you shoot better.
Yes. To couple that, it feels like film is making a mild comeback.
I know. I mean, last year, a lot of the Best Picture nominees were shot on film. Anora shot on film. The Brutalists famously shot on VistaVision, which resurfaced as a old format that found life again.
Yeah, and we're getting into like how difficult it was to get VistaVision processing up and running for the Brutalists.
Yeah, I mean, just to recap with the difference in VistaVision, so most film cameras, they're shooting 35mm and they're shooting vertically, and the picture comes in like in the vertical strip, and so you can only get as wide as the film is wide. VistaVision rotates that 90 degrees, so the film strip is going in horizontally, being exposed, and you're able to expose a larger image. Not as large as IMAX, but larger than you would get with a 3-perf or 4-perf 35mm.
Yeah, so like if you're shooting anamorphic, you're squeezing all that aspect ratio into a vertical, like a square box, versus VistaVision where you now have more of a rectangle, more of a 16:9 box.
Exactly.
So you're getting more film grain per pixel. I can't even say pixel. Right? More real estate per frame.
Yeah, I've tried. What did we call resolution back? What did we call it?
What was a pixel before pixel?
What was?
Anyway, I'm glad we're having this conversation because these are some of the things that are.
I feel like we've lost the language.
Yeah,
of what did we even call this? Making a comeback. VistaVision, IMAX. Also, like Christopher Nolan, huge fan of IMAX.
What's he working on?
The Odyssey, which was
Homer,
one of my favorite books in reading in high school. I'm excited about this one.
That's awesome.
But yeah, they're shooting that on IMAX, and there was talk that IMAX was developing a new IMAX camera, sort of specifically for Christopher Nolan, that was supposed to be smaller and also run more quiet, because a big issue with IMAX is it's very loud and
very heavy.
It's huge.
I think it's
heavy.
Like 200 pounds.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Like you can't shoulder rig that.
No, I don't believe so. I think they were trying to do more, version that you could shoulder rig handheld and quieter so they could record sync sound, because I believe everything has to be ADR'd after because it's just too loud to record anything practically.
Talk about the expectations of this film. I mean, Christopher Nolan has been hitting home runs like 100% of the time for the last 2 decades. And now you have Matt Damon as Ulysses. You have some big A-listers. It's being shot right now on a new camera. I can't wait to see it. This is the return of the film that Seth Rogen was talking about.
Just takes one film to turn it all, the conversation around. Yeah, I'm excited. Yeah, we mentioned that last time too. It's like this year might be a little bit quieter in the big blockbuster films, but there's a lot coming out in 2026.
Yep.
Okay, so film, let's see. I have a crap bag of just film-ish stories. I don't have any good logical order to go through them. But talking about Team 2 Films, and so one of their arguments was like shooting on film, because it is a limited resource, because, every time you hit roll, you're running through film, you got to pay for the film stock, then you got to pay for the processing, you got to pay for the digitization. So
there's a counter in your head.
Yeah, you need to have that discipline to know, like, when you hit record, you want to use this. Whereas I feel with digital, there's such a, it's pixels, it's like bits, it's a media card. We got tons of storage. We can just copy it over. We don't have to, there's no actual like monetary cost. We can talk about there are costs associated with storage and hard drives and all of that, but you're not like, we got to pay the, per foot. We don't have to do that with digital. Yeah, I've worked with some DPs, that are younger, and seems to be more of a habit where they'll just like kind of hit roll and like let the thing record, and then you get
filmmaking.
Yeah, and then you get a whole like, string out of just like the different B-roll shots, but then I still see them moving around around in between takes, and it's like one big long file.
Well, one of the things that bugs me the most is like when you get into double-digit take numbers, you're like on take 25, like, are you sure you didn't get it in the last 24 takes?
No, I mean, Fincher is known for doing a lot of takes, and he shoots film as well. So I think Social Network, they did like 99 takes on one of the like the restaurant scene.
So you're on one shot the entire day.
Pretty much, I guess.
That needs to have more discipline. I agree. So film is going to enable you to naturally build that into your head.
It forces you to have that discipline. That was something. So yeah, a good story with this is El Mariachi. So you're familiar with El Mariachi, Robert Rodriguez's first film.
Legendary film.
And one of the parts of it being legendary was that he shot it on a $7,000 budget. And part of the lore, I mean, true story, but lore behind that was that he raised the money by doing a medical test for a month and living in this medical facility to do some drug trial stuff. And that was the $7,000 was like the payment.
That's such a cool story for such a cool film. And this is like in the early 90s, I think.
I believe it was the early 90s.
Like 91, 92.
Yeah.
So adjust that for inflation is probably like, I don't know, 15, 20,000 today.
Yeah, which is
still nothing.
Right. And obviously, but you're in the 90s and your options are either film or like VHS or something that where the quality is nowhere near what film would be. And I believe his original plan was like he was just going to try to crank out these kind of low budget action films, you know, shot in Mexico where he has friends and family and call in a lot of favors, and then try to sell it, you know, for whatever, 50,000 and, you know, make more of these.
Yeah.
But two things that sort of went under the radar from like that story. I mean, then the story happens, he makes a film and then he gets it into Sundance and then it sort of becomes this big like hit, and then that launches his career.
Then Desperado. And
Desperado, What's Finding Mexico, Spy Kids, Sin City, some of the Star Wars TV shows. But one of the things or two things that get lost in that, I mean, part of the reason the film was so good and so dynamic was he shot like over 100 or 200 films like growing up as a kid on VHS, and he would just make these kind of short fun action films. So he had the reps
experience.
He had
the reps.
He had the reps. And even though he's shooting VHS, you know, which is a cheaper format, he was still, you know, back in the day, it was linear editing, not non-linear editing. So
you cut the film.
Or two VCR. You know, do the two VCRs, and you got to like play your raw footage, and then you're editing by like hitting record on the other one. And so you got to like piece your VHS together in sequence.
Insane.
And so he got very good at like, you know, I need this shot, which came into play in El Mariachi when he like sprung to get some film, but he had a very limited film stock. Right. And so he knew exactly what shots he needed to get. And then the other thing was that $7,000, pretty much that entire budget went to film stock and processing. That was the bulk of the money.
What a smart way to spend the $7,000. It's like the one thing that he physically can't do because he doesn't have a chemical processing lab and a dark room and all that. But everything else he was able to scrap up together, you know, whatever friend has an extra, whoever's house has a location.
I think he was able to borrow the camera.
Yeah,
and he just like knew some people. So he was able to like, you know, the production value raises the perceived value of the budget.
Incredible resourcefulness.
And just using all the resources, yeah. And then the punchline to that is like once it played at Sundance, he met some rep from Kodak. And I think they found out that like all of the money went to film stock. And then they were like, oh, we have an independent film program. We would have just given you the film stock.
That's awesome.
But yeah, the big thing is like he had the discipline to, you know, that film forces you to have from all of his previous runs.
I mean, can you imagine him not completing the film because he ran out of film stock? Like that's the tragedy. That's the pressure you're under. You know, this is like all the money I have. I went through some horrible drug medical exam thing to get the $7,000. You better believe I'm going to make the movie of my lifetime.
Right. You got to make it work.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, even at film school, they would give us, it was like everyone had to have the same resources. And so basically for like one level of films we did, it was like, all right, everyone, you get like 2 cans of film.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
And so it's like, you know,
go make magic.
You know what your limited resources are. You know, there's no other additional media cards or anything. It's like it's 2 cans of film. That's all they're going to pay for. And that's all they're going to pay for processing.
Yeah.
And that's a can is about 16 minutes, I believe, a reel for 60 millimeter.
I think like now you have 2 terabyte cards and a lot of the directors are like, oh, but I want the 4 terabyte. Like, really? What are you going to do with all that data?
What if you're shooting on the 12K PYXIS or the 17K Ursa? Yeah, it fills up. But that's the other hidden costs of digital, especially like storage and archiving.
Yeah.
Where, okay, sure, you're not paying for the processing, but film, we know that is proven to be archival.
Time.
We know. Yeah, it's like
like when Resolve or whatever Premiere is transcoding, there's hours and hours of transcoding on, you know, 4 terabytes of data.
Yeah.
Time is money.
Yeah. But even after you're done and storing it. Like we know we could just take a film canister and throw it in a shelf in a climate controlled environment. And
it's good for 100 years.
It's literally good for 100 years because you have this 100-year-old film.
Yeah.
You know, you can literally see it. So as the technology and standards change, it's like, well, we just need to shine light through it. We can see it.
We can figure out how to scan it 100 years from now with better scanners, but you still have.
We can see it's still there. Yeah. Whereas digital storage, it's like hard drives fail, CDs will fail, DVDs will disintegrate.
Formats are gone.
Right. Yeah. Like, what, did you ever put stuff on zip drives or jazz discs or those other formats that now are obsolete?
Like, what's OpenEXR 20 years from now, whatever format that is, is it going to read this format?
I remember seeing some rough numbers where it was like the cost to archive a movie shot on film was roughly like $1,000 a year, and the cost to archive digital was like about $10,000 a year.
Yeah,
just from like having to keep moving the data around and make sure everything
take
stays
a leap
relevant.
Here with the discipline and the psychology thing, because it's really interesting. If you know that you've only got a couple of takes per shot, you're going to spend as a director way more time with the actors to rehearse and get those emotions, get those beats right, and then shoot it. And I think that overall makes the production cheaper, because then you're not spending as much time on set.
Speeds up the editing.
Yes, all of the above. So I think having some kind of a funnel with film here is actually very conducive to a better film.
Yeah. Or even if you just do it, like learn on it, shoot a film on it, kind of get some of that discipline that you can apply to digital. Obviously, it doesn't make sense to shoot film for everything. It's still costly, but it's not off the table as I think people might think or perceive. Yeah, NFL Films is a separate part of NFL that shoots. They don't really do anything with the broadcast. They're shooting on the sidelines, like very cinematic, super slow-mo, high quality looking shots of the games that they license out or use in documentaries or other films. And I could have sworn I saw a stat a long time ago that they were like the single largest purchaser of film stock, like for a few years running. I can't find proof to back that up again, but they were a very large purchaser of film stock, because they would just shoot film to get that like 120 frames per second, like very beautiful cinematic. And
imagine how many NFL games there are at any given time. How many cameras you need for coverage and so on.
And they were big film users. And again, also I did find some articles saying like, well, I don't know if we'll switch to digital because, film, you could just put on the shelf. It's, the archive quality.
Yeah.
And this was another thing I can't prove, but I believe Ari had a few 16 millimeter cameras. There was the SR2, the SR3, kind of the workhorse 16 mil cameras. And then they came out in the early 2000s with the 416, which was a more updated, streamlined, shoulder mountable version of their 16 millimeter camera.
Yeah.
And it was also kind of came out at the time when everything was started to switch to digital. So I think
but you got to remember the early days of digital, like broadcast cameras were terrible.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe you had like Collateral that was shooting digital, but it had a very distinct look.
Yeah.
And then maybe like Star Wars Episode 2 was like another
like if you go to like
digital
Ayrton Senna F1 coverage or some of the like the 90s stuff where they first started to use broadcast digital cameras, that footage just didn't hold up, man. Like, you have chromatic aberration, you have like scan lines and all these other things. Yep.
Yeah. So the 416 was it kind of came out and then the digital switch happened. But I also could have sworn that camera was developed for NFL Films, but I can't find proof of that. But NFL Films was a big user of film stock.
So we're sort of talking about like the last fall of film, and now we're talking about the rise of film.
And we can't talk about film 2 without talking about the two big film manufacturers, Kodak and Fujifilm, were pretty much the two.
Yeah. How are they different?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, every film stock has a distinct look. I mean, so Kodak had
the Chroma
7219, 72. I mean,
what was it called?
It gets to the point where you remember the numbers of the film stock.
Kodachrome?
Kodachrome was their
photography.
I don't think they ever did a film stock with Kodachrome. I'm curious about that. But Kodachrome was known for accurate. I mean, a lot of this comes down to color science and like how well these stocks can accurately reproduce the color they see or have the vibrant colors. And then sensitivity. I mean, so, 50D was a popular one if you're shooting outside, a 50 ISO, daylight. I mean, your film stock was color timed based on the color temperature that you were going to be filming in, or there was a variety of techniques to
what blows my mind is they did all this without knowing what the final look and feel of the image is, and now we could just look at it in a viewfinder.
I will say, I feel like, being able to see what you're getting.
Like you're using light meters for exposure and just trusting that whatever iris.
That is why you have to be, that is a seasoned cinematographer. You know, like, when you hit record, you know what you're going to get.
And you're talking about recording on like $1 million film sets where there is like, imagine shooting Gone with the Wind
I mean, this was like a fear with The Godfather. This was like a complaint, like the studio was watching the dailies and, you know, they're intentionally shooting dark, but it's not like shooting raw format now where it's like, oh, it's dark, but we can recover all of that.
Yeah,
it's like
in post, there's dynamic range left. Yeah,
there are a few things you could do, but you're pretty limited on like what you shot is what you get.
Yeah, no, but the nice thing about film was like if you did blow it, like if it was overblown, the highlight clipping would be very aesthetically pleasing. It would bloom and halate
and not
nicely.
Just be the ugly like white that we get now.
So it was like, oh, that looks cinematic, even though you completely blew the exposure. Or if it's too dark, then the crush range also looks really cinematic. So it was kind of like a give and take.
Yeah, it's funny or ironic to mention, you know, it's like there's also a lot of resources and research and tools that go into adding film grain back into digital.
Oh boy.
Resolve has its own built-in film look emulator that they just launched last
really
year.
Good.
Dehancer is another big popular Resolve plugin that is pretty much adding halation, adding film grain. I mean, just film grain overlays are hugely popular.
I remember
with, like, YouTubers and stuff.
Like early 2000s, I would go back and forth from work to home, and there would be a really nice, souped-up, expensive Corvette on the freeway. Probably gets out to work at the same time as me. The license plate said film look on it.
Yeah.
So it's somebody who made their living, a pretty good living, just converting digital to film.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was a big business for a while. And now everybody has that power on their Resolve desktop.
Yeah. But no, as far as difference Kodak and Fuji, I'm thinking back. I mean, because also I've not shot film in a long time, but I think I pretty much always just leaned on, I think it was the 7219 was the stock number, 500T, 500 tungsten, because for that reason, I knew with the 500 tungsten, we would definitely get something. Like it was more a safety net of like, I know if we hit record, we're going to pick up stuff. We're not going to run the risk of being underexposed and stuff's going to be too dark.
Exactly. Yeah. You rather err on the side of overexposure with film, I think.
Yeah.
Again, don't listen to us. Listen to a real cinematographer.
Listen to someone who has ASC after their name.
Yes. So it's interesting that Kodak and Fujifilm are going in two completely different paths.
They are now. I mean, you know, there's still the famous story where it's like Kodak did develop digital camera, like the early first digital camera technology, and then was like, it's going to cannibalize our film sales, and, you know, shelved it, and you know, they died ish. Yeah, looking at them today. So I was at CES earlier this year, and it was crazy because there were two Kodak booths. One Kodak booth did have like consumer cameras, like kind of Polaroid-ish and, you know, actual camera stuff. But then the other booth was the wildest thing. It was like the Kodak brand on every type of product under the sun, like boom boxes, smartwatches, binoculars.
It was all yellow and red.
And Kodak. I mean, it was like purely, I mean, the brand obviously still has like, it's probably the most valuable part of this company. Like it is still a very like valuable
also,
story
I would
brand.
think that brand would resonate with Gen Z a lot because it's like a legacy brand.
It's very vintage. Yeah.
Predates
It's
millennials.
a great brand. Yeah. But yeah, it was basically just licensing like on everything. And it just made no sense. I mean, didn't they have that Bitcoin miner box? Was that like a Kodak? There was like a Kodak, like Bitcoin mining box. Absolutely crazy. Nothing. I mean, I think anything they're still generating visually wise, photographically, is like consumer still cameras.
Yeah.
And I'm going to guess they're probably just bringing in other people's chips and building that. Fuji, on the flip side.
Yeah. What's Fuji up to?
Has successfully embraced the digital
age.
Yeah. They've had their digital still cameras for a while.
Yep.
And then last year they came out with the Fujifilm GFX Eterna.
Yes.
Which is
with the weird handle on the side. We're going to put up a screenshot here.
A 65 millimeter digital sensor camera for around $7,000 or $8,000.
Yes.
So like,
and
crazy big sensor,
really compact body,
small body, compared to other 65 millimeter sensors, pretty affordable price.
Yep.
And this is their, you know, original sensor and color science.
Yep.
Yeah. Fuji, I would say, has successfully transitioned and adapted, maybe like slower than, you know, other companies where you have Red and Ari that successfully transitioned earlier.
Yeah, we talked about Panavision, right?
Panavision, yeah.
How they sort of went the way of the dinosaurs a little bit. You know, Kodak did as well. Fuji made then it's so hard for a tech company to do, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a completely separate thing.
The last episode, we were talking about Apple and are they going to transition into the AI age, right?
Yeah.
Although they dominated the hardware software age. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, but Fuji has definitely been doing a lot more updates. Also, you know, going back to the flip side, if you're still shooting film and then digitizing, not a lot of people realize, but like Blackmagic sells a film scanner. It's a $30,000 Cintel film scanner. I believe it's one of the companies they acquired years ago.
I think $30,000 is a bargain because those are generally like giant refrigerator size things that are like hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah. Most likely will be at NAB. They usually have it in a little corner, or it's just like, by the way, we still sell film scanners. You can scan your film into Resolve.
Yeah. So how does that work? So you scan a frame of film and it's like a EXR file, and then you apply like a Cineon LUT to it to get it into Rec 709 or whatever.
I have no idea.
Okay. I just don't know what the post-production workflow is.
Plug it into your Thunderbolt on your computer and hit import.
Almost. You got to spool up the perforations.
I do remember it wasn't the Cintel scanner, but in the Team 2 films, they did show that process of how they were scanning it. And the other interesting thing was like how many times they would have to run the film through like just dusters just to ensure like that there's like zero dust. Because like if you scan if you scan it and you have dust on the negative, when you scan, it's going to be in the image. So like
maybe some new creators like that. They're sprinkling in more dust for a more grimy look.
Yeah, when's the day that Mr. Beast is going to start shooting his I spent $1 million on film stock to shoot this video.
I would love that.
So yeah, they still Blackmagic still sells film scanners. And yeah, we mentioned at the beginning of the episode that there were a good amount of Best Picture nominees that were shot on film, but then there's also been a good blend of movies and TV shows that are shooting on film and using virtual production. Two of the big ones, Poor Things from a few years ago.
Yes.
Virtual production background for a lot of the sets, but shot on film. And then also Fallout more recently from Amazon.
I think the most amount of minutes shot on film with VP is probably Fallout.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's interesting. So when Fallout was being shot, obviously it was a big secret. There was a giant stage in New York. I knew some of my friends who were working on it. They couldn't talk about it. And then I was at a party and one of my friends that is on it kind of whispers to me and says, hey, they're shooting on film. I'm like, wait, what? Yeah, it's amazing because you don't need Genlock. There's no moire. The pixels bloom better. Like film and VP work really well together.
So there is no concern of like, do you have to sync anything, or it's just because the refresh rate is so fast that doesn't...
Yeah, I think because so much light is entering each film exposure, it doesn't matter what refresh rate the LED really is at. I mean, those things are refreshing at 3,000-4,000 times a second versus this thing is open for 33 milliseconds. So you can imagine how many times it's being sampled. And then moire goes away because you have no pixels on the sensor.
Because it's film.
It's film stock. Yeah. Like the pixel would be the actual chemical molecule, which is like way smaller than a pixel. Yeah. And then also you get all the added benefits of dynamic range on film, which is arguably more aesthetically pleasing. So like if you do clip something, it looks beautiful and not harsh, or if you crush something, it also looks beautiful. Color reproduction is also amazing, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of sensors struggle with red specifically. So like if you have a really saturated red, by the time you bring it into post, it starts to look more burgundy, like it starts to have an off color.
Okay.
Where film preserves the red really, really well. So yeah,
all right.
Great marriage. And who would have thought?
Yeah, older tech and newer tech.
Yes.
That is interesting. Yeah, I never thought about those benefits. I remember one of the earlier uses of virtual production was the Sandra Bullock film, The Space One.
Oh, Gravity.
Yeah.
Gravity was all green screen. There was no LED volume work.
Oh, that wasn't LED?
Yeah, the virtual production bit.
Or maybe I'm thinking of First Man. That was another space.
First Man did use some LED volume work, yes. Yeah. And I think it was shot on film.
But yeah, their LED volume stuff was like stars in the moon, not crazy backgrounds.
Stuff far away. Yeah, I mean, Fallout was, I would imagine, really difficult for a VP volume because of all that detail in the environment and then all that physical set that had to sit in front of it and blending and matching between the two. They're shooting season 2 right now here in LA.
Hey, LA production.
Yes. Yay.
Aside from the discipline, benefits that we talked about, you think there's any visual advantage shooting film? And also sort of the question of like, can you shoot digital and use the tools at hand to make it look as visually pleasing as film? Or, is there something that like film's always going to contain that like digital can never replicate?
All right, I'm going to make a really extended reach here. Hang with me.
Let's go.
I think it's the same difference as a really capable photographer versus a generative AI image that's meant to mimic photography. So what I mean by that is you take something like The Brutalist, which was shot on VistaVision, and it just naturally, intrinsically has this cinema feel to it, right? Of course, the aspect ratio and like the contrast and the color shift, like those are the things you can quantify. But then you're consuming this thing for 90 minutes and now your brain is kind of in this style aesthetic choice. Yes, you can totally replicate it with Resolve up to a point, but I think there is a 10% of it that you just can't get. That just comes naturally with the territory. And it's the same thing with real life photography. You give, a really capable photographer a Canon 5D Mark IV, like a very standard DSLR, tell them to go do some street photography, and then you give a really capable generative AI artist, ChatGPT image generator, tell them to prompt. And yeah, they'll look about the same, 90% there, but you will prefer the natural one. And you won't know why. Because our brain looks for fine details that sometimes we don't even process. Like, we just prefer things. I'll even give you another stretch. It's the same reason why we have Uncanny Valley. With digital humans, we're so used to looking at real faces. Our species have survived on trusting families and friends and partners over the eons, that anytime we see anything off about a face that we look at a TV, instantly stuff gets triggered in our brain and we don't really know why. So these are all the things that are unfortunately very esoterical and very kind of out in the ether, but it's definitely an element that is there. And it is why I think film ultimately is the most natural medium for cinema. Was that too much? You can edit it out. Okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking too, like all these things, AI and film and digital, it always comes back to the story. And, you could have the most beautiful VistaVision or IMAX shot film, but if it's crappy or your boring story, versus something that's shot on an iPhone.
Yeah.
And is engaging in a, moving story, like, you'd still prefer to watch the engaging, moving story.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't want to say film is the only way. Like, we've had...
No, I mean, my question was like more on an aesthetic level.
Yeah.
Is there something that just film and celluloid will always have that you can't match with digital?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that digital cinema cameras have a really hard time matching with film is motion blur, because that exposure is happening over time, and that film frame is getting exposed, and then it is then going away, and the next frame is coming in, and then that shutter angle is going in and out. Like, these are physical and chemical reactions that are happening. There's a literal
shutter spinning in front of the film. Yeah, I mean, that did improve when we got like global shutter and a different way to process the image. Even then,
it's all electronically controlled. Like, it's mimicking something that is physical.
Yeah, I feel like, that's a good, I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. It's like, so much of digital is mimicking what we already created with, even going all the way to specifically the film emulation plugins and modifications.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why Lawrence of Arabia holds up even today. Like, it was shot, 80, 90 years ago. It's as good aesthetically as anything that we're producing in 2025.
I think that's a whole separate conversation. It's something I'm not even familiar or knowledgeable enough, but seeing the discourse online of like, why do more films today look just color-wise, like a bit more muted, a bit less saturated, compared to something like Lawrence of Arabia or the Technicolor films that had like these very vibrant, very saturated colors.
It imprints on your head so much better because it's just so much more stimulating to watch. The argument that I heard is because most modern films have to shoot more conservatively because of VFX. So you can't put a hard light on someone because in VFX that'll be a problem. You can't punch up the saturation because in VFX that'll be a problem. So then everything is shot very, very muted and drab and then punched up in post.
So do you think that could be something where AI becomes the solution? If the reason is because it's going to be hard to, I'm assuming, to comp or segment the things you shoot on set to composite them into post.
Yeah.
If the AI tools get better at helping the crews do compositing.
And AI can relight.
Can we shoot? Yes. Yeah.
So like there's also...
Can we shoot higher key, more saturated, even if we're going into a VFX pipeline?
I think so.
There you go, people. And that could be a good argument. If you're on the edge of AI, yes, we can bring back the Technicolor, not maybe specifically Technicolor, the super saturated colors and use AI to help make that happen.
Yeah. Look, we see a lot of, you and I cover a lot of AI. We see a lot of generative AI content, stuff that's made out of nothing, just generated. I think the key to success of AI in our industry is perhaps not so much that, but it's really building a post-process pipeline, a VFX pipeline, if you will, and having AI make VFX incredibly accessible and quick.
Yeah, so we could do more creative work.
Yeah.
Yeah, similar to what we talked about at the NAB episode with the new AI tools helping out in editing and other tasks. Like that's
where
the
it's
good
at.
stuff. Yeah. And there was one other sort of in the film space-ish, but more in the lens space.
Yeah, so anamorphics for the longest time, since the film days, have been kind of inaccessible for the normal videographer. Like you and me, Joey, we have cameras, but do we have anamorphic lenses? Probably not.
No.
I just got my first one.
Thought about messing with them, but not really. Yeah.
So,
I mean, the advantage of anamorphic is you can squeeze a wider picture into a smaller sensor, right? And then when you play it back, you get this big wide image, but you're able to squeeze it.
Yeah, so you can take like, you know, a 2:7:8 aspect ratio or whatever crazy and then squeeze it into a 2:4:8 aspect ratio. On paper, that's the big advantage. The stuff that's not on paper is like the bokeh looks oval. The shallow depth is way more buttery. There is a pleasing color shift, so it'll like desaturate certain shades and saturate certain shades to make things more cinematic. There's a natural vignette that forms at the edge of the frames. All those things that we were missing in the sort of prosumer DSLR, Sony FX3, Red Komodo users, PYXIS users.
Hyper clean, like very sterile looking digital images.
Exactly. So now you can actually afford an anamorphic. There's a few lower end lens manufacturers like DZO, Sirui, Blazar, and I think a lot of these guys are Chinese manufactured. And now they're offering anamorphics, and for like $1,000, $2,000.
What were they traditionally? 10, 20, 30?
I mean, 10, 20 is like entry level. So if you're looking at
for
like
one lens,
a
prime, right?
So if you're looking at a Cooke S8 special flare, 50,000 a lens. And then if you are talking to somebody like Greg Fraser, they're taking that and detuning it, or like taking it apart completely, rebuilding it from scratch. And now it's like $1 million lens that's only one in the world.
Right. Serial, one of one.
Yes.
Yeah. Atlas, I was trying to think of it when you're naming the company. Atlas is another lower cost anamorphic lens manufacturer.
Atlas Mercuries are probably the most affordable of the traditional anamorphics. You also have Argenau, French company. There's a few, you know, of course, the RE Master Primes and stuff. But those are all inaccessible for the average filmmaker, especially as we go into indie Hollywood and sort of the small scale Hollywood that we covered on this show, right? Like we think that's the next wave of filmmakers.
Content creator space.
Yes. Or the YouTube creator economy. I think these next generation of anamorphics that are affordable, that can autofocus.
This is a new one from Sirui lens. And so it's anamorphic and autofocus.
Yes.
Which also, that sounds crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy because the autofocus algorithms are happening on the sensor, and now it's receiving an image that it's not used to because it's like warped and it's a different aspect ratio. It's skewed. It's way more soft and buttery than what it's used to. So the fact that anamorphics can autofocus at all is a technical achievement. And the fact that you can buy this for relatively low prices, you're talking about, you know, single digit thousands. That's incredible. And if you pair that with all of the tools that we have available now with generative AI and sort of easier VFX, easier cloud workflows, I mean, this is the best time as an indie filmmaker to get into this.
Or even just smaller camera bodies and being like, I'm thinking, you know, like, well, what's the most common use case for something where you need autofocus? And it's like when you're running gun and handheld. So either if you're doing like a very indie kind of film like the El Mariachi, but you know, you want to like make your budget look like bigger, more impressive and anamorphic, or, you know, documentaries. I remember when there was like kind of the switch when documentaries started shooting on the 5Ds and the DSLR cameras and then the C300s, and, you know, suddenly like documentaries like look very cinematic.
So you can have your person that was focus pulling the AC, just give them another camera and now your second coverage, because this thing is autofocusing itself.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'd like to get my hands on some of these anamorphic lenses. I've never shot anamorphic, so I would like to love to mess around with it.
I think you'll see some of them at NAB.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. All right. Well, that's a good way to wrap up our film intermediate episode. Yeah. If you got any thoughts about like shooting with film, not shooting with film, digital, let us know in the comments.
If you want to share any projects, we'd love to take a look. So let us know.
All right. Links for everything we talked about, as usual, denoisedpodcast.com.
Thanks for all your support on YouTube and on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We're continuing to grow, and we love it if you can spread the word, tell your friends, tell your family about Denoised.
All right, thanks everyone. We'll catch you in the next episode.